private jet engines hummed with indifference as Ryan kicked his pregnant wife off the aircraft, forcing Natalie's 6-month belly past rows of empty seats to make room for his mistress, a Skylux Airlines flight attendant whose professional smile had long ago turned into something intimate and conspiratorial with her lover. Ryan's mother stood blocking the aisle, her laughter cruel and sharp as broken glass, as she watched Natalie's tears fall onto the plane's carpeted floor, the older woman holding her phone high to capture what she called the trash taking itself out. What neither Ryan nor his mistress nor his venomous mother knew, what their arrogance had blinded them to completely, was that Natalie had just purchased the entire airline in a secret Trillionaire's transaction, and I'm making her the owner of the very company the mistress served, the planes they flew in, and effectively the future of every employee whose name appeared on Skylux's payroll. The mistress adjusted her uniform with practiced seduction, settling into the seat still warm from Natalie's body, unaware she now worked for the pregnant woman she'd helped betray, ignorant that her career hung on the mercy of someone she'd just publicly humiliated. Ryan's mother had always despised Natalie, treating her like an unwanted pest who trapped her precious son, never suspecting the daughter-in-law she'd tormented controlled wealth that made their family's fortune look like pocket change, billions hidden behind trusts and investments, while she'd played the role of humble, grateful wife. As Natalie descended the jet stairs, her hand protective over her unborn child, she activated the phone's voice recorder and spoke 3 words to her legal team that would trigger consequences already prepared. Dominoes arranged and waiting for her command to fall. How would Ryan's world shatter when he discovered who his wife really was? What would the mistress's face show when her employment file crossed her new owner's desk? Could his mother's laughter survive the moment she learned the truth about the woman she'd mocked? And what justice would be fitting for those who'd kicked a pregnant woman off a plane to elevate an affair? Dear viewers, you're about to experience a story that teaches timeless lessons about the danger of underestimating quiet people, the inevitable justice that follows cruelty, and why power without character leads to destruction. You'll learn profound truths about loyalty, the consequences of family toxicity, the strength found in apparent weakness, and how secret power wielded wisely can correct terrible wrongs. This story will educate you on respecting others regardless of their perceived status, the karmic consequences of infidelity and public humiliation, and why treating vulnerable people with cruelty is the greatest character failure. Please share in the comments what lessons you took from this story and what actions you would have taken if you were in Natalie's position facing such betrayal and humiliation. Would you forgive or seek justice? Subscribe for more compelling, entertaining, and morally instructive stories that combine unforgettable drama with life-changing lessons. The February wind cut through Natalie's silk blouse as she stood at the base of the aircraft stairs, watching the private jet's door seal shut with a hiss that sounded like finality itself. Her hands trembled, not from cold, yet from the adrenaline coursing through her veins like liquid fire, as she pressed one palm against the curve of her belly where her daughter kicked in protest against the chaos her mother's heartbeat revealed. The tarmac stretched endlessly in all directions, a concrete desert separating her from the terminal building where strangers moved like ants behind glass windows, completely unaware that they'd just witnessed a woman's entire life fracture into irreparable pieces. 20 minutes earlier, everything had appeared normal. Or as normal as life could be when you'd spent 3 years hiding your true identity from the man who'd promised to love you in sickness and in health. Natalie had boarded the jet with Ryan for what was supposed to be a weekend trip to Aspen, her pregnancy making her movements slower yet no less graceful, while his mother, Patricia Donovan, a woman whose family tree was printed in society pages and whose opinions carried the weight of old money, had already claimed her seat with the territorial certainty of someone accustomed to getting everything she demanded. The jet belonged to Skylux Airlines Charter Division, a detail Natalie had noted with bitter irony when Ryan had booked the flight, knowing what her lawyers had finalized in sealed conference rooms just hours before. Ryan had been distant during boarding, his attention fixed on his phone screen with an intensity that spoke of secrets being maintained through carefully crafted text messages. His wife had learned to recognize the signs over the past 8 months, the way his thumb moved in rapid-fire responses, the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth when he thought no one was watching, the protective angle at which he held the device to prevent wandering eyes from glimpsing names or content. Marriage had taught Natalie many things, yet perhaps the most valuable lesson was that people reveal their true nature, not in grand gestures, yet in the small, thoughtless moments when they believe themselves unobserved. The mistress had appeared at the jet's entrance like an actress making a calculated entrance onto a stage designed specifically for her performance. Her name was Amber Sinclair, a detail Natalie had learned from the private investigator's report that now sat in a locked drawer in her attorney's office. And she wore her Skylux Airlines uniform with modifications that violated every professional standard outlined in the employee handbook. Skirt hemmed 2 inches too short, blouse unbuttoned 1 button too low, makeup applied with the heavy hand of someone performing femininity rather than embodying it. The regulation smile she'd offered Natalie had contained edges sharp enough to draw blood, a greeting that acknowledged the wife's presence while simultaneously dismissing her relevance. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Donovan," Amber had said, her voice honey-sweet with underlying venom. "But there's been a seating issue. So, Nana, we're going to need you to take a different flight." The words had been rehearsed, Natalie could tell, practiced in mirrors or perhaps whispered between stolen kisses in hotel rooms paid for with joint credit cards. Ryan had stood behind his mistress with his hand resting possessively on her waist, a gesture he hadn't offered his pregnant wife in months, while his eyes held a coldness that transformed his familiar features into those of a stranger wearing her husband's face. Patricia's laughter had started as a low chuckle, yet it had built into something uglier, a sound that echoed off the jet's cream-colored interior and burned itself into Natalie's memory with the permanence of scar tissue forming over fresh wounds. Finally, Patricia had announced to no one in particular, her phone already recording the moment for later distribution to her country club friends. "My son is choosing quality over charity cases. Do you know how embarrassing it's been? Explaining to my bridge group why Ryan married a nobody with no family, no connections, no value to our name?" The physical removal had been swift yet brutal in its efficiency. Ryan's hands, the same hands that had once held Natalie's face with tenderness during their vows, had gripped her upper arm with enough force to leave bruises that would blossom purple and yellow over the coming days. He'd walked her backward down the aisle, past rows of empty leather seats that had witnessed this domestic execution, while Amber slid into the spot still warm from Natalie's body heat with a triumphant smile that would haunt the coming weeks. Patricia had followed the procession with her phone raised like a torch, narrating the expulsion with commentary that mixed cruelty with maternal pride in her son's newfound backbone. The jet stairs had felt endless beneath Natalie's feet, each step downward a descent, not just in altitude, yet in the systematic destruction of everything she'd believed about the man she'd married and the family she'd tried to join. Now, standing on the tarmac with rain beginning to spot the concrete around her designer shoes, purchased with money from accounts Ryan didn't know existed, Natalie pulled her phone from her purse with hands that had stopped shaking. The device felt heavy with possibility, weighted with the power to reshape reality with nothing more than a few carefully chosen words. She dialed a number saved under a generic contact name, waited through 2 rings, and when her head attorney answered, she spoke with a voice that had shed all traces of the trembling wife who'd begged her husband to reconsider. "Execute Protocol Omega," Natalie said, watching the jet begin its taxi toward the runway. "All of it. Today." The Skylux Airlines corporate headquarters occupied 47 floors of steel and glass in downtown Manhattan, a monument to aviation excellence that pierced the skyline with architectural arrogance. Inside the executive boardroom on the 45th floor, 12 faces stared at Natalie with expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed hostility as she took her seat at the head of the mahogany table, a position that had belonged to Gerald Hutchinson until the acquisition papers had transferred ownership at 9 o'clock that morning. The leather chair still held the impression of its previous occupant, yet Natalie settled into it with the comfort of someone reclaiming something that had always belonged to her, even when others had temporarily borrowed the space. Gerald stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, when his reflection ghostly against the afternoon sun, while his knuckles pressed white against the glass, as if he could somehow push through the barrier and escape the reality unfolding behind him. He'd built Skylux from a regional carrier into an international powerhouse over 32 years, yet financial pressures and poor investments in cryptocurrency schemes had left the company vulnerable to exactly the kind of hostile takeover he'd spent his career avoiding. The mysterious conglomerate that had purchased controlling interest had remained anonymous through layers of shell corporations until this moment, when a pregnant woman in her late 20s had walked through the boardroom doors and introduced herself as their new majority shareholder. "This is absurd," Gerald finally spoke, turning from the window with the desperate confidence of a man watching his legacy dissolve. "You can't possibly have the capital for this acquisition. The purchase price was $7.3 billion. Who are you really representing?" His question hung in the air like smoke, dense with the assumption that Natalie was merely a messenger for someone with actual power, a pretty face sent to deliver news from men who conducted real business behind closed doors. Natalie opened the leather portfolio she'd brought, extracting documents that her legal team had prepared with meticulous attention to every regulatory requirement. "I'm representing myself, Mr. Hutchinson," she replied, sliding the paperwork across the table's polished surface. "My name is Natalie Thorne Donovan. Even though the acquisition was processed through the Thorne Family Trust, which controls assets valued at approximately $42 billion across various sectors, including technology, real estate, and now aviation. The name Thorne carried weight in financial circles, yet it was old money that had learned centuries ago to operate in shadows rather than spotlight. Wealth that predated the American Revolution, yet had multiplied exponentially through careful stewardship across 9 generations. The boardroom's atmosphere shifted like barometric pressure dropping before a storm. Several board members reached for their phones, no doubt searching for information on the Thorne family, while others exchanged glances that acknowledged their complete failure to conduct adequate due diligence on the buyer. Gerald's face cycled through emotions: disbelief, recognition, fury, and finally resignation, as he processed the information that this young pregnant woman commanded resources that made his own considerable fortune look insignificant. "The Thorne family?" Gerald repeated, his voice losing the aggressive edge it had carried moments before. "I thought that bloodline had died out. The last verified Thorne was—" He trailed off, his mind clearly working through genealogical puzzles and society page rumors. "Your father was Thomas Thorne, the one who disappeared from public life 30 years ago?" Natalie nodded, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her belly, where her daughter performed acrobatic movements that doctors had assured her were completely normal for 26 weeks. "My father valued privacy over publicity, Mr. Hutchinson. Why, he taught me that true power operates most effectively when it remains invisible to those who might challenge it." She paused, letting that lesson settle over the room like dust finding its level. "Which brings us to the purpose of this meeting. I'm implementing immediate changes to company policy, personnel, and operational standards." She pulled a second document from her portfolio, a termination notice prepared on official Skylux letterhead, with signatures from the Human Resources Director, who'd been summoned to the building under emergency protocols. Amber Sinclair, employee number 47,283, flight attendant assigned to Charter Division, is terminated effective immediately. Security has already been dispatched to retrieve her access credentials, uniform, and any company property in her possession. Natalie's voice remained steady. A professional, yet underneath the corporate language lay currents of personal vendetta that several astute board members clearly recognized. "You can't terminate someone without cause," interjected Martha Chen, the head of Human Resources, a woman whose reputation for protecting employee rights had survived 3 CEOs and countless restructurings. "Ms. Sinclair has been with the company for 4 years with an exemplary record. What grounds?" "Violation of conduct standards, Section 12, Paragraph 4, Natalie interrupted, her eyes meeting Martha's with the cold precision of someone who'd memorized the entire employee handbook. "Engaging in inappropriate relationships with passengers, which Ms. Sinclair has been documenting extensively on social media under a pseudonym that our IT department identified within 30 minutes of me requesting the investigation." She slid printed screenshots across the table. Posts from a private Instagram account showing Amber in various romantic poses with Ryan, some clearly taken aboard Skylux aircraft, complete with captions that bragged about stealing rich men from their boring wives and perks of working at altitude. Martha's expression transformed from defensive to understanding as she examined the evidence. Professional misconduct was grounds for immediate termination under federal aviation regulations, particularly when it involved exploiting professional access for personal gain. Several board members leaned forward to view the screenshots, their faces registering varying degrees of shock at the explicit nature of Amber's online bragging. Furthermore, Natalie continued, pulling additional documentation from what was clearly a very well-organized portfolio, I'm implementing new screening protocols for all Charter Division employees. Background checks will now include social media audits, psychological evaluations, and ethics training focused specifically on maintaining professional boundaries with high-net-worth clients. Her eyes scanned the faces around the table, noting who appeared supportive and who seemed resistant to the changes she was mandating. Gerald had moved from the window to lean against the credenza, his arms crossed over his chest in the defensive posture of someone watching his company transform before his eyes. "And what about me?" he asked, cutting through the policy discussion with the question everyone was thinking, yet no one had vocalized. "I assume you're cleaning house at the executive level as well?" Natalie considered him with an expression that revealed nothing about her intentions. "That depends entirely on your willingness to implement my vision for this company, Mr. Hutchinson. I don't remove people who provide value, yet I also don't tolerate those who cling to outdated methods that prioritize profit over people." She stood, her pregnancy making the movement slightly awkward, yet no less authoritative. "You have 48 hours to demonstrate which category you belong in." As she gathered her documents and prepared to leave, her phone buzzed with a text message from her private investigator. The message contained a single line. "Target has landed in Aspen." Mother posted humiliation video to social media, currently viral with 847,000 views. Natalie smiled, though the expression held no warmth. Phase 2 was about to begin, and Ryan had no idea that the viral video his mother had posted was about to become the most expensive social media content in history. Ryan's phone had been ringing for 43 minutes straight when he finally emerged from the Aspen Resort's master suite, his hair still wet from the shower he'd shared with Amber, while his mother unpacked her Louis Vuitton luggage in the adjacent room. The device vibrated against the marble countertop with an insistence that suggested emergency rather than routine business calls, yet the number displayed belonged to his assistant Trevor, a man Ryan paid specifically to handle crises without bothering him during personal time. The 6th consecutive call finally broke through Ryan's irritation enough to answer, his finger swiping across the screen with the aggressive impatience of someone accustomed to immediate solutions to minor inconveniences. "This better be important, Trevor," Ryan said. "I'm walking onto the suite's private balcony where mountain peaks stretched across the horizon like teeth waiting to devour the unwary. I'm in the middle of a very important weekend, and whatever's happening at the office can wait until Monday." Behind him, Amber's laughter drifted through the open door, accompanied by his mother's approving commentary on how refreshing it was to spend time with a woman who understood luxury rather than his previous wife, who'd always seemed uncomfortable in wealthy circles. Trevor's voice emerged from the phone speaker with a tremor that Ryan had never heard in 5 years of employment. "Sir, we have a situation that absolutely cannot wait. Your wife, your ex-wife, Natalie, she's..." The assistant's words tumbled over themselves like dominoes falling in unpredictable patterns. "One is she's been calling our banking partners, all of them, and they're freezing accounts, canceling credit lines, pulling funding from the commercial development project. Sir, she's destroying everything." The mountain view blurred as Ryan's brain struggled to process information that made no logical sense. Natalie didn't have the power to influence banking relationships he'd spent a decade cultivating, didn't possess the connections or resources to impact his business empire, didn't understand finance beyond the household budget he'd given her access to through their joint checking account. "That's impossible," Ryan said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone explaining basic physics to a child. "Natalie doesn't even know who our banking partners are. She has no influence in financial circles." "Ach, you're panicking over nothing. Sir, please listen to me, Trevor interrupted, his professional composure crumbling entirely. She's not operating as Natalie Donovan. She's operating as Natalie Thorne. The Thorne family, sir. The banking dynasty. She's been calling in favors from institutions that her family has controlled for over 2 centuries, and they're choosing her over us without hesitation. The assistant's breathing sounded ragged, as if he'd been running marathons through corporate headquarters. Goldman Sachs pulled our line of credit 30 minutes ago. JP Morgan just called to say they're accelerating the repayment schedule on the Chicago property loan. We're looking at a $170 million shortfall by end of business Monday. Ryan's fingers tightened around the phone until the titanium case creaked under pressure. The name Thorne echoed in his memory like a bell tolling from some distant cathedral. He'd heard it whispered at charity galas and investment conferences, always spoken with the reverent fear people reserved for entities that could reshape markets with single decisions. His wife couldn't possibly be connected to that family, couldn't have hidden that kind of lineage through 3 years of marriage, couldn't have played him so completely while he'd assumed her quiet nature indicated insignificance rather than strategic patience. There's more, sir, Trevor continued, his voice dropping to the tone people used when delivering terminal diagnoses. Trillionaire, your mother's video, the one she posted showing your wife being removed from the plane, it's everywhere. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, every major outlet. But the narrative isn't what she intended. People have identified Natalie as a thorn. They're calling you a monster for kicking a pregnant trillionaire off a plane. The company's stock dropped 19% in afternoon trading. Our PR team is fielding hundreds of interview requests, and they're all framing this as the biggest mistake in modern relationship history. Ryan turned from the balcony to find his mother standing in the doorway, her face pale as she held her own phone with trembling hands. Patricia's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the horror spreading across her features as she scrolled through social media comments that had transformed from supportive to absolutely vicious in the hours since her video had gone viral. Ryan, she whispered, her voice stripped of the triumphant cruelty it had carried on the plane. They're saying terrible things. They found out who Natalie really is. They're calling me They're threatening to boycott every charity I'm involved with. The Junior League already asked me to resign from the board. Amber appeared behind Patricia, wrapped in the resort's complimentary robe, her expression shifting from confusion to dawning panic as she checked her own phone. I just got an email from Skylux, she said, her voice climbing toward hysteria. I'm terminated, effective immediately. They're demanding I return my uniform and access credentials within 24 hours, and they're threatening legal action for, she scrolled frantically, for conduct violations and breach of professional standards. They're saying I could face federal charges for misusing my position for personal gain. The balcony seemed to tilt beneath Ryan's feet as the full scope of his miscalculation crystallized with brutal clarity. He'd kicked off a woman who could buy and sell his entire business empire before lunch, had humiliated someone whose family connections could close doors he'd spent his entire adult life trying to open, had chosen a flight attendant over a trillionaire because he'd been too arrogant to look beneath the surface of his wife's deliberately cultivated ordinariness. Call her, Ryan said, his voice hoarse with desperation that tasted like acid in his throat. Call Natalie, now. We need to fix this before... Before what? Patricia interrupted. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated. Before she destroys us? Ryan, I laughed at her. I filmed myself laughing at a pregnant woman from one of the most powerful families in American history. I called her trash on video that 7 million people have watched. How do you fix that? Her hands shook so violently that her phone clattered to the marble floor, the screen cracking in a spiderweb pattern that somehow felt prophetic. Trevor's voice emerged from Ryan's phone speaker again, small and distant. Sir, there's one more thing. Skylux Airlines just released a statement. They've been acquired by the Thorne Family Trust. Your wife, Natalie, she owns the entire airline. Wearing the plane you kicked her off of? She owned it. The company that employed Ms. Sinclair? Natalie's the CEO now. And according to the press release, she's implementing comprehensive reforms to ensure passenger dignity and employee professionalism. which everyone is interpreting as a direct response to what happened. Ryan's knees buckled, forcing him to grab the balcony railing for support. The mountain peaks that had seemed majestic moments ago now felt like walls of a prison closing in from all directions. Amber had started crying, her carefully constructed seduction crumbling into the reality that she'd lost her career and her reputation for a man who was currently watching his own world collapse. Patricia had retrieved her phone and was frantically deleting the video from every platform. Yet the internet's memory was permanent. Her screenshots and recordings already archived across thousands of devices worldwide. "Get me on the next flight to New York," Ryan said, his mind racing through potential strategies for damage control that all seemed hopelessly inadequate. "Contact our best lawyers. Find out what it takes to undo this, to apologize, to make this right." Even as he spoke the words, he knew the truth. Some mistakes couldn't be undone, some humiliations couldn't be forgiven, and some women, once underestimated and discarded, would never allow the men who destroyed them to forget the cost of that arrogance. His mother's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. "What have we done?" The conference room where Natalie agreed to meet Ryan exactly 1 week after the incident looked nothing like the intimate spaces where they'd once shared coffee and morning conversations. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed Manhattan's skyline in crystalline detail, while the long glass table reflected overhead lights with surgical brightness that made hiding emotions impossible. Ryan sat across from his wife, though legally she remained his wife for another 60 days until their divorce finalized, with his attorney positioned beside him like a bodyguard whose weapons were legal briefs rather than firearms. Natalie had arrived alone, her pregnancy now undeniable at 27 weeks. Yet her solitude spoke of confidence rather than vulnerability, the quiet power of someone who needed no reinforcements when facing defeated enemies. Ryan's appearance had deteriorated dramatically in 7 days. Dark circles shadowed his eyes like bruises. His usually immaculate suit showed wrinkles that suggested he'd slept in his office, and his hands trembled slightly as they rested on the table's cold surface. His attorney, Marcus Wellington, from one of Manhattan's most prestigious firms, had clearly coached him on contrition, yet the desperation in Ryan's eyes went beyond any rehearsed performance. "Natalie," he began, his voice cracking on her name, "I need you to understand that I never meant for things to escalate like this. The situation on the plane was a mistake, a terrible lapse in judgment. Oh, and I'm asking, begging for you to consider the possibility of forgiveness." Natalie's expression remained neutral as she studied the man she'd married in a small ceremony 3 years ago, back when she genuinely believed love could bridge the gap between authenticity and the role she'd been playing. "A mistake," she repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "Is that what you call forcing your 6 months pregnant wife off an aircraft to seat your mistress? A lapse in judgment." Her hand moved to rest on her belly, where their daughter kicked with increasing frequency, as if the baby could sense the tension saturating the air. "Tell me, Ryan, at what point during that mistake did your judgment tell you this was acceptable behavior?" Marcus cleared his throat, intervening with the smooth professionalism of someone accustomed to salvaging disasters. "Mrs. Donovan, or should I say Ms. Thorne, my client acknowledges the severity of his actions and is prepared to offer substantial financial compensation as part of the divorce settlement. We're talking full custody concessions, property transfers, and a lump sum payment that would reflect genuine remorse for—" "Stop," Natalie interrupted, her voice quiet yet carrying enough authority to silence the attorney immediately. "You came here thinking this is about money, that I want your money, or his properties, or some percentage of assets he's accumulated." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on Ryan's face. "I don't need anything you could possibly offer, Mr. Wellington. What I needed was basic human decency from my husband, my respect from my mother-in-law, and the right to travel to Aspen without being physically removed from an aircraft I own." The revelation still seemed to wound Ryan freshly, his face flinching as if she'd struck him. Ryan dismissed his attorney with a subtle hand gesture, waiting until Marcus had reluctantly gathered his briefcase and exited before speaking again. "I didn't know," he said, the words emerging barely above a whisper. "About your family, about your wealth, about any of it. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me treat you like—" He trailed off, unable to complete the sentence that would require him to confront exactly how he treated the woman carrying his child. Like someone without value, Natalie finished for him. Soye, like someone whose feelings didn't matter because she brought no social capital to our marriage. She stood, walking to the windows where the city spread beneath them like a kingdom of glass and steel. I didn't tell you because I wanted to be loved for myself, Ryan. Not for my family name, not for my trust fund, not for the doors I could open or the connections I could provide. I wanted what every woman wants, to be chosen because I was enough exactly as I was. Her reflection in the glass showed tears tracking down her face, yet her voice remained steady. Instead, I discovered that the moment someone you perceived as better came along, you discarded me like garbage. Your mother filmed it. Your mistress celebrated it. Honey, and you participated in my humiliation without a single moment of hesitation. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crack the glass table. Ryan's breathing had become audible, ragged with emotions he'd probably never learned to process. Grief, shame, regret, and the dawning comprehension that he'd destroyed something irreplaceable because he'd been too blind to see its value. "What do you want from me?" he finally asked. "Public apology? Financial ruin? Both? I'll do whatever it takes to make this right, to repair what I've broken." Natalie turned from the window, her expression softening slightly, yet not enough to suggest forgiveness was anywhere on the horizon. "I don't want your ruin, Ryan. Despite everything, I don't want you destroyed." She returned to her seat, folding her hands over her belly in a gesture that was simultaneously protective and powerful. "What I want is for you to understand the cost of treating people as disposable, your business losses, your social exile, your mother's resignation from every board she cherished. These aren't punishments I'm inflicting. These are natural consequences of your choices becoming public knowledge." She pulled a folder from her bag, sliding it across the table. "Skylux Airlines will survive and thrive under new management focused on dignity for passengers and employees. Amber Sinclair has been offered a severance package contingent on her signing non-disclosure agreements and completing ethics training before seeking employment elsewhere. Your mother's charitable organizations have received anonymous donations large enough to continue their work despite her departure, because the people they serve shouldn't suffer for her cruelty." Natalie paused, letting Ryan absorb the fact that even in her justified anger, she'd acted with more grace than he'd shown her. "As for you, the divorce will proceed as planned. I'm keeping my maiden name for our daughter, who will know both her parents, yet will be raised to understand that character matters more than status." Ryan opened the folder with shaking hands, scanning documents that outlined custody arrangements far more generous than he deserved. Regular visitation, shared holidays, involvement in major decisions. "You're giving me access to our daughter after everything I did?" His voice broke completely, my tears finally spilling over despite his obvious efforts to maintain composure. "I'm giving our daughter access to her father," Natalie corrected gently, "because she deserves to make her own judgments about who you are, and because I believe people can change if they're willing to confront their failures honestly." She stood again, preparing to leave. "But understand this, Ryan. If you ever treat her the way you treated me, if you teach her that wealth determines worth or that cruelty is acceptable when directed at those you perceive as lesser, I will use every resource at my disposal to protect her. Not to punish you, yet to ensure she grows up knowing her value is inherent, not determined by anyone else's opinion." Ryan remained seated as Natalie walked toward the door, his entire body sagging under the weight of comprehension that arrived far too late. "I loved you," he said to her, retreating back. "I know you don't believe that now, yet I did love you. I just didn't value you enough to protect that love." Natalie paused at the threshold, her hand on the doorframe. "That's the saddest part, Ryan. Love without respect isn't love at all. It's just ownership wearing a prettier name." She glanced back one final time. "I hope you learn the difference before our daughter is old enough to notice you haven't." The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a chapter ending. Ryan sat alone in the conference room as afternoon light shifted across the city, his reflection in the glass table showing a man who'd had everything and had thrown it away because he'd never learned to see value in quiet strength, dignity and humility, or power in those who chose not to display it. His phone buzzed with another notification, probably his mother calling again, or his lawyers or reporters still chasing the story that had consumed news cycles for a week. He didn't reach for it. Instead, he pressed his palms against his eyes and wept for the wife he'd lost, the daughter who would grow up knowing he'd kicked her mother off a plane, and the man he could have been if he'd possessed the wisdom to recognize a treasure when it had been standing right beside him. 3 floors below, Natalie emerged onto Madison Avenue where her driver waited with the car door already open. She slid into the back seat, her hand instinctively moving to her belly where her daughter performed what felt like celebratory somersaults. "Where to, Ms. Thorne?" the driver asked, meeting her eyes in the rearview mirror. "Home," Natalie said simply, though the word meant something different now, not the penthouse she'd shared with Ryan, yet the brownstone she'd purchased under her family name, the space where she'd begin raising her daughter surrounded by art and books, and the quiet dignity she'd always valued. "And then tomorrow we start building something better." As the car pulled into traffic, Natalie looked back once at the building where she'd left Ryan with his regrets and his consequences. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction in his suffering, yet she felt something perhaps more valuable, the absolute certainty that she'd reclaimed her power not through revenge, yet through the simple act of refusing to shrink herself for those too limited to see her worth. The city lights were beginning to illuminate as evening approached, each window a story of lives intersecting and diverging, of choices made and consequences faced. Natalie's story was far from over, yet this chapter had closed with the kind of justice that couldn't be bought or negotiated, the justice of a woman who'd stood up, walked away, and built a new life from the ashes of the old one, stronger and wiser for having survived the fire. Dear viewers, thank you for experiencing this powerful journey of betrayal, hidden strength, and ultimate justice. The moral lessons here are profound. Never underestimate quiet people, one who for their silence may conceal empires. Never humiliate others based on perceived status, for you cannot know the power they truly hold. Never mistake kindness for weakness or humility for insignificance. This story teaches us that true character is revealed in how we treat those we believe have no power to affect us, and that cruelty always extracts a price far higher than the momentary satisfaction it provides. What did you learn from Natalie's story? What would you have done differently if you were in her position? Would you have shown the same mercy, or would your justice have been harsher? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your perspectives on forgiveness, consequences, and the balance between grace and accountability. If this story moved you, taught you something valuable, or made you think differently about how we treat others, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more compelling, entertaining, and deeply educational stories that combine unforgettable drama with life-changing moral lessons. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today.